In the harsh landscape of 1890s Texas, where the wounds of frontier conflict still run deep, a solitary former soldier named Jake Morrison, 35, lives a quiet life, hunting game to survive. Haunted by his past as a cavalry soldier who once fought against Apache tribes, Jake has isolated himself from society, seeking redemption in solitude. One fateful autumn day, while tracking deer in the rugged hills near the Rio Grande, Jake discovers something that will change his life forever. A young Apache woman, Aiyana, meaning eternal blossom, 25, severely wounded and left for dead. Despite the deep-seated hatred between their peoples, Jake makes a choice that defies everything he was taught. He carries her back to his remote cabin instead of returning with the meat he desperately needs. As Jake nurses Aiyana back to health, two broken souls begin to heal each other, but their fragile bond will be tested by the ghosts of Jake's violent past. The search parties looking for Aiyana and the unforgiving prejudices of a world not ready for their connection. In a story of redemption, forgiveness, and impossible love, both must decide: can two people from opposite sides of history's bloodiest conflicts find peace in each other's arms? The Texas sun hung low in the October sky, painting the rugged hills in shades of amber and crimson. The land stretched endlessly, mesquite trees scattered like broken promises across the dusty earth, their twisted branches reaching toward a heaven that seemed too far away. Jacob Morrison, Jake, to the few who still remembered his name, crouched behind a weathered boulder, his rifle steady against his shoulder. At 35, his face bore the map of hard years, deep lines carved around his pale blue eyes, a jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw, and a permanent weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. His dark brown hair, streaked with premature gray, hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore simple clothes, a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, dusty trousers, and boots that had walked more miles than most men would in a lifetime. Around his waist, a gun belt held his Colt revolver, and across his back, a hunting knife in a leather sheath. These were the tools of survival, nothing more. Jake's breath came slow and measured as he watched a mule deer grazing 300 yards downslope. The buck was magnificent, at least 200 pounds of meat that would keep him fed through the coming winter. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, his body perfectly still. Just breathe, just like the old days. Except now you're hunting food, not men. The thought came unbidden, as it always did. 7 years since he'd left the cavalry. 7 years since he'd hung up his uniform and walked away from Fort Concho, unable to stomach another raid, another burned village, another child's cry silenced by violence he could no longer justify. The deer raised its head, nostrils flaring. Something had spooked it. Jake frowned, keeping his rifle trained on the animal, but his attention shifted. In his years out here alone, he'd learned to read the land like a book. Every sound, every movement told a story, and right now something was wrong. The deer bolted, disappearing into a thicket of cedar. "Damn it," Jake muttered, lowering his rifle. That was 3 days of tracking wasted. He had maybe a week's worth of jerky left, a few cans of beans, and some cornmeal. Winter was coming fast, and out here, 30 miles from the nearest town of Redemption Creek, hunger wasn't just uncomfortable. It was deadly. He stood, his knees protesting the movement. Too many years sleeping on hard ground, too many old wounds that never quite healed right. He was about to turn back toward his cabin when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A low, pained whimper carried on the wind. Jake froze, every instinct from his military days suddenly alert. His hand moved to his revolver. Out here, sounds like that could mean a wounded animal, dangerous and unpredictable, or worse, it could mean people, and people were always more dangerous than animals. The sound came again, weaker this time. It was coming from a ravine, about 200 yards to the east, hidden behind an outcropping of red rock. Every logical part of Jake's brain screamed at him to walk away. It wasn't his business. Whatever trouble lurked in that ravine had nothing to do with him. He'd left that life behind. The life of getting involved, of playing hero, of believing he could make a difference, but his feet were already moving. "You're a fool, Morrison. A goddamn fool." He approached the ravine carefully, rifle at the ready, scanning the rocks above for any sign of ambush. The former soldier in him never quite went away, no matter how much he tried to bury it. As he rounded the outcropping, the ravine opened before him, a slash in the earth about 30 feet deep, with steep walls of red clay and loose rock. And there at the bottom lay a woman. Even from his vantage point, Jake could see the blood. It stained the earth around her, dark and terrible. She was on her side, one arm stretched out, the other clutched to her abdomen. Her clothing, traditional Apache dress, deerskin with intricate beadwork, was torn and soaked crimson. Jake's breath caught in his throat. An Apache woman, out here alone. Wounded, maybe dying. His mind raced through possibilities. A raid gone wrong, punishment for some tribal offense, a conflict with settlers. The Apache wars were supposedly over, but conflicts still flared up like lightning strikes, sudden, violent and unpredictable. The woman moved slightly, her head turning. Even from this distance, Jake could see her face. Young, probably mid-20s, with high cheekbones and long black hair, matted with dirt and blood. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. "Walk away. This isn't your fight. You help her, you'll have every settler in 3 counties calling for your head. You'll have the army asking questions. You'll have her people thinking you're the one who did this to her." But Jake was already scrambling down the slope, loose rocks sliding beneath his boots. He didn't know why. Maybe because he'd seen too much death already. Maybe because he was tired of walking away. Or maybe because something in that woman's stillness reminded him of all the times he'd arrived too late, found villages already burning, found people already beyond saving. He reached the bottom of the ravine, his boots splashing in a thin stream of water that ran along the rocky floor. Up close, the woman's injuries were even worse than he'd feared. A deep gash across her left thigh, still bleeding. What looked like a bullet wound in her side, the entry point small, but the exit wound in her back, torn and ragged. Bruises covered her arms and face. She'd been beaten before she was shot. Jake knelt beside her, his hands hovering uncertain. He'd treated wounded soldiers before, pulled men back from the edge of death more times than he could count. But this felt different. His hands, which had steady enough to hold a rifle, now trembled. The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, almost black, filled with pain and confusion. They focused on Jake's face, and instantly, terror flooded them. She tried to move, to scramble away, but her body wouldn't obey. A cry of pain escaped her lips, a sound so raw and desperate that it cut through Jake like a knife. "Easy," Jake said softly, holding up his hands, palms out. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't understand English, or if she did, she didn't trust it. Her hand fumbled at her belt, searching for a weapon that wasn't there. Blood bubbled from the wound in her side with each gasping breath. Jake knew he had seconds to make a decision. She was dying. If he left her here, she'd be dead by nightfall sooner. If predators caught the scent of blood, if he tried to help her and she fought him, they'd both end up in trouble. He made his choice. Moving slowly, keeping his movements visible and non-threatening, Jake shrugged off his vest and then pulled his shirt over his head. The woman watched him with wide, terrified eyes, but she was too weak to do more than watch. "I'm going to stop the bleeding," Jake said, his voice steady and calm, the same tone he'd used to talk down spooked horses and panicked soldiers. "I know you can't understand me, but I need you to know. I'm trying to help." He tore his shirt into strips, working quickly. The wound in her side was the most serious. He pressed one strip of fabric firmly against it, and the woman gasped, her body going rigid with pain. "I know," Jake murmured. "I know it hurts, But you're losing too much blood. He tied the makeshift bandage tight around her torso, then moved to the gash on her thigh. It was deep, but hadn't hit the artery. Small mercy. He bound it as best he could with the remaining fabric. The woman had stopped fighting. Her eyes were still open, still watching him, but the terror had given way to confusion. She whispered something in Apache, words Jake couldn't understand but recognized as a question. "My name's Jake," he said, knowing she probably didn't understand but needing to say something. "I'm going to get you out of here." He looked up at the ravine walls, calculating. There was no way he could climb out while carrying her. The slope was too steep, the rocks too loose. He'd have to follow the ravine downstream until it opened up onto flatter ground. That meant at least a mile of walking, maybe more. Jake slipped his arms under the woman's body, one beneath her knees, one behind her shoulders. She cried out as he lifted her, and he felt her blood, warm and sticky, soaking into his undershirt. "I've got you," he said. "I've got you." She was lighter than he expected, maybe 100 pounds if that. Starvation had been eating away at her even before the wound. As Jake began walking downstream, cradling her against his chest, the woman's head lolled against his shoulder. Her breathing came in short, ragged gasps. The ravine seemed to stretch forever. Jake's arms burned with the effort of carrying her, and his boots kept slipping on the wet stones. The sun was sinking fast now, shadows creeping across the canyon floor like dark water. The woman stirred, her lips moving. She was trying to say something. Jake looked down at her. "Don't try to talk. Save your strength." But she kept trying, forcing the words out through gritted teeth. Finally, she managed one word, repeated like a prayer or a curse. "Naliahe. Naliahe." Jake didn't know what it meant, but the desperation in her voice made his chest tighten. Whatever had happened to her, whatever had brought her to this ravine, it had been bad, very bad. After what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, the ravine finally opened up onto a flat plain. Jake's cabin was still 3 miles northwest, back through rough country. His arms felt like they were on fire, and sweat poured down his face despite the cooling evening air. The woman had gone quiet, her eyes closed. For a terrible moment, Jake thought she was dead, but then he felt the faint rise and fall of her chest against his. 3 miles. You can make 3 miles, you've marched 20 on empty stomach and 3 hours sleep. You can do this. But he'd been younger then. Harder. Less broken. Jake pushed forward, putting one boot in front of the other. The landscape blurred around him, mesquite and sage and endless dust. His world narrowed to the weight in his arms, the sound of her breathing, the burning ache in his muscles. Somewhere overhead, a hawk cried out, circling on evening thermals. The stars were beginning to appear, cold and distant. Jake's cabin finally appeared on the horizon. A simple structure of rough-hewn logs and a stone chimney, with a small corral out back where his horse, an aging bay gelding named Soldier, stood watching their approach with pricked ears. He kicked open the door. He never locked it, there was nothing inside worth stealing, and carried the woman directly to his bed. It wasn't much, just a simple frame with a corn husk mattress and a couple of wool blankets, but it was all he had. He laid her down gently. In the dim light filtering through the cabin's single window, her face looked even younger, almost childlike. Blood had soaked through his makeshift bandages. Jake lit 2 oil lamps, filling the cabin with warm, flickering light. His hands moved automatically, gathering supplies: clean cloth, whiskey for disinfectant, needle and thread, his sharpest knife, and a pan of water he set to boil on the pot-belly stove. As he worked, the woman's eyes opened again. She watched him move around the cabin, that same mixture of fear and confusion in her gaze. Jake pulled up a chair beside the bed and met her eyes. "I was a soldier once," he said quietly, not sure why he was talking, but unable to stop. 7th Cavalry. I rode with units that burned your villages, killed your people. I did things I'm not proud of, things that wake me up at night, things I can't ever make right." The woman stared at him, understanding nothing of his words but perhaps sensing something in his tone. "I can't undo what I did," Jake continued. "But maybe I can do this one thing right. Maybe I can save you." He reached for the whiskey bottle, poured some on a clean cloth, and looked at her seriously. "This is going to hurt," he said. "A lot. I'm sorry." Then he began the painful work of cleaning and stitching her wounds, while outside, the Texas night settled over the land like a dark blanket, and two people from opposite sides of history's bloodiest conflicts began a journey neither of them could have imagined. The woman's screams echoed through the cabin as Jake worked on her wounds. He'd heard men scream like that before on battlefields, in field hospitals, in places where pain was the only language left. But this was different. This was intimate, immediate, and it tore at something deep inside him. "I'm sorry," he kept murmuring, though he knew she didn't understand. "I'm so sorry." The bullet wound was the worst. He had to cut away dead tissue, clean out dirt and debris, and stitch both the entry and exit wound. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard living, moved with surprising delicacy. The muscle memory from his cavalry days came flooding back, all those field surgeries, all those desperate attempts to keep friends alive, just a little longer. The woman had stopped screaming. Now she just whimpered, her body rigid with agony, her fingers clutching the blanket beneath her so hard that her knuckles turned white. Tears streamed down her temples, disappearing into her dark hair. When Jake finally tied off the last suture, his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air. He sat back, his hands shaking from the adrenaline draining out of his system. The woman's eyes had closed, her breathing shallow but steady. She'd passed out from the pain, probably for the best. He covered her with his cleanest blanket, then stood and walked to the cabin's single window. Outside, the moon had risen, nearly full, casting silver light across the scrubland. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely, mournful sound that matched the ache in Jake's chest. "What the hell have you done, Morrison?" He'd brought an Apache woman to his cabin. In Texas, where memories of Apache raids were still fresh, where settlers still told stories of kidnappings and massacres, where prejudice ran deeper than the Rio Grande. If anyone found out, Sheriff Coleman in Redemption Creek, or worse, some of the former rangers who still prowled the territory, looking for any excuse to finish what the army had started. They'd both be dead, her for being Apache, him for being a traitor to his race. But even knowing all that, Jake couldn't bring himself to regret his choice. He turned back to look at the woman on his bed. In the lamplight, her face had relaxed slightly, the lines of pain easing. She looked peaceful, almost serene despite everything she'd been through. Jake pulled a chair close to the bed and settled in for what he knew would be a long night. He kept a rifle across his lap and a pot of water heating on the stove. Every hour he checked her wounds, changed the blood-soaked bandages, and wiped her face with a cool cloth. Her skin burned with fever. Infection was setting in, as he'd feared. Around midnight, she began to thrash and moan, lost in fevered dreams. She spoke in Apache, rapid sentences that rose and fell like music, though the melody was dark and frightened. Jake heard certain words repeated, "Nalia hey," and another that sounded like Shiki's brother, if he remembered correctly from his cavalry days. He held her hand, feeling helpless. "You're safe here," he told her, knowing she couldn't understand. "Whatever happened, whoever hurt you, they can't reach you here." Her fingers tightened around his, surprisingly strong despite her weakness. Her eyes opened, unfocused and glassy with fever, and she looked directly at him. She spoke one word, clear and distinct. "Ash." Jake didn't know what it meant, but something in the way she said it made his throat tight. The night stretched on. Jake dozed in his chair, jerking awake at every sound, the wind rattling the shutters, mice scurrying in the walls, soldier snorting in the corral. Each time he woke, he checked to make sure the woman was still breathing. Dawn came slowly, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Jake stood and stretched, his back protesting from the night in the chair. The woman was still asleep, but her breathing had evened out. The fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't gotten worse either. He needed to check his traps, feed Soldier, and somehow find food for 2 people instead of 1. The deer he'd been tracking was long gone, and his supplies were dangerously low, but he couldn't leave the woman alone. Not like this. Jake compromised by doing quick chores, feeding and watering Soldier, collecting eggs from his 3 chickens, checking the rabbit snares he'd set near the creek. He worked fast, always keeping the cabin in sight. The whole time his mind raced with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? Who had hurt her so badly? And what was he supposed to do now? When he returned to the cabin, the woman's eyes were open. She watched him enter, her gaze tracking his every movement. The fever glaze was gone, replaced by sharp alertness. She was assessing him, evaluating the threat, looking for escape routes. All things Jake recognized because he'd done the same in hostile territory. "Morning," Jake said, keeping his voice gentle. He set down the basket of eggs and held up his hands to show he was unarmed. "I'm going to make some food. You need to eat. Keep your strength up." The woman didn't respond, but her eyes followed him as he moved to the stove. Jake cracked 3 eggs into a pan, added some salt and a precious bit of butter he'd been saving. The smell of cooking filled the cabin, and he heard the woman's stomach growl audibly. When the eggs were done, he divided them onto 2 tin plates and brought 1 to the bedside. The woman eyed the food warily. Jake sat in his chair and made a show of eating from his own plate. Sensed, not poisoned, just eggs. Still, she didn't move. Her pride wouldn't let her accept food from him, even though she was clearly starving. Jake sighed and set her plate on the small table beside the bed. "It's there when you're ready," he said. Then he returned to his chair and finished his own breakfast in silence. After a few minutes, the woman's resolve broke. Moving stiffly, wincing with each motion, she reached for the plate. She ate slowly, carefully, watching Jake the entire time. When she'd finished, she set the plate down and spoke. A question from the tone, though Jake couldn't understand the words. "I don't speak Apache," he said apologetically. "I wish I did. Would make this whole thing a lot easier." The woman frowned, clearly frustrated. She pointed to herself and said something that sounded like Aiyana. Jake's eyes widened. "Is that your name?" "Aiyana." She nodded once. A small gesture, but significant. Jake touched his own chest. "Jake, my name is Jake." "Jake," she repeated, her accent making it sound exotic, almost melodic. Then she pointed to the bandages wrapped around her torso, to the stitches on her leg, and asked another question. "Why did I help you?" Jake guessed. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to figure out how to answer when she couldn't understand him. Finally, he stood and walked to a small wooden box he kept on a shelf. He opened it and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed a younger Jake in his cavalry uniform, standing with a group of other soldiers. But Jake wasn't pointing at himself. He was pointing to the background of the photo, where the ruins of an Apache village smoldered, bodies lying in the dirt. "This is what I was," Jake said, his voice rough. "This is what I did. I followed orders. I rode with men who saw your people as nothing but savages to be exterminated, and I helped them do it." Aiyana stared at the photograph, her expression unreadable. Jake put it back in the box. "I can't undo those things, can't bring back the people I helped kill. But maybe," he looked directly at her, "maybe I can do something right for once. Maybe I can save one life instead of taking them." The words hung in the air between them. Aiyana searched his face for a long moment, and Jake had the unsettling feeling that she understood far more than the words themselves, that she could read his guilt, his shame, his desperate need for redemption like they were written on his skin. Finally she spoke. Jake shook his head. "I don't know what that means." Aiyana touched her hand to her chest, then pointed to Jake. "Ashki," she repeated. Then she made a gesture that Jake interpreted as rejection or negation, followed by another word. Inda. Jake frowned, trying to understand. In his cavalry days, he'd picked up a few Apache words, enough to give basic commands, to threaten, to demand. Inda was one he remembered. It meant enemy, or white man. "You're saying I'm not the enemy?" he guessed. "Or that I'm not like other white men?" Aiyana nodded, then winced and touched her side where the bullet wound was. The movement had pulled at the stitches. "Don't move too much," Jake said, standing quickly. He checked her bandages clean, no fresh bleeding. "You need to rest, let those wounds start healing." Over the next 3 days, they fell into a tentative routine. Jake would wake early, tend to his minimal livestock, check his traps, and try to hunt. Aiyana would sleep or watch him from the bed, her dark eyes missing nothing. He brought her food and water, changed her bandages twice a day, and tried to make her as comfortable as possible. Slowly, painfully, they began to communicate. Jake would point to objects, water, bread, blanket, and say the English word. Aiyana would respond with the Apache equivalent. She was a quick learner, picking up simple English phrases with surprising speed. Jake suspected she'd had some contact with English speakers before, though whether friendly or hostile, he couldn't tell. On the 4th morning, Jake woke to find Aiyana sitting up in bed, her legs swung over the side. She was pale and sweating from the effort, but determined. "Whoa, hold on," Jake said, hurrying over. "You're not ready for that yet. Need walk," Aiyana said in halting English. She pointed to a corner of the cabin. "Need privacy." Jake felt his face heat up. He'd been dealing with her necessary functions as clinically as possible, but he understood her need for dignity. "All right," he said, "but let me help you." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Together, they made their slow way across the cabin. Aiyana's jaw was clenched against the pain, but she didn't make a sound. When they reached the corner where Jake kept a chamber pot behind a privacy screen, he stepped back. "I'll be right outside if you need me," he said. He waited by the door, listening to her labored breathing, ready to rush in if she fell. After a few minutes, she called out, "Jake." He found her leaning against the wall, her face white as chalk, sweat beading on her forehead. Without a word, he swept her up in his arms and carried her back to the bed. She was trembling, exhausted from the small effort. "Too soon," Jake said, laying her down and pulling the blanket over her. "You lost a lot of blood. Your body needs time." Aiyana looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw something other than suspicion or weariness in her eyes. It might have been gratitude. It might have been respect. Whatever it was, it made something in Jake's chest tighten. "Good man," she said slowly, struggling with the English words. "Even though, Inda, I'm trying to be," Jake replied quietly. "Trying real hard." That afternoon, as Jake was preparing their meager lunch, more eggs and some cornmeal mush, he heard horses, multiple horses, moving fast. His blood turned to ice. He rushed to the window and peered out through a gap in the shutters. 4 riders were approaching from the east, kicking up dust. Even from a distance, Jake could see the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels. "Damn it," he breathed. Aiyana had heard them too. She tried to sit up, her eyes wide with fear. Jake hurried to her side. "Don't move. Don't make a sound. Do you understand?" She nodded, her hand clutching at his sleeve. "Who?" "I don't know, but nobody comes out here unless they're looking for something." He glanced around the cabin. There was no way to hide her, no way to explain her presence if they came inside. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin. Jake recognized them immediately. Ray Coleman, the sheriff from Redemption Creek, and 3 of his deputies. Coleman was a hard man in his 50s, with gray mutton chops and eyes like flint. He'd been a ranger during the Apache Wars and had never quite accepted that the fighting was over. Jake grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. He stood on the small porch, the rifle held casually but ready. "Sheriff Coleman," Jake called out. "Didn't expect visitors way out here." Coleman sat his horse easily, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Morrison, been a while since you came into town." Don't need much from town, Jake replied, keeping his voice neutral. What brings you out this way? We're tracking, Coleman said. He spat tobacco juice into the dust. Had some trouble 3 days ago. Group of Apache jumped a family wagon about 15 miles southeast of here. Killed the man, wounded his wife. And boy, they'll live, but it was close. Jake's stomach dropped, but he kept his expression carefully blank. That's so. Yeah, we tracked them this far, but the trail went cold. You seen or heard anything unusual? Nothing, Jake said. It's been quiet out here, like always. One of the deputies, a young man named Billy Ferris, with more enthusiasm than sense, piped up. We found blood in a ravine about 2 miles from here. Lots of it. Looks like maybe one of them savages got wounded. Coleman shot the deputy a look that could have curdled milk, but the damage was done. The sheriff turned back to Jake, his eyes narrowing. Mind if we take a look around? Just to be thorough. I do mind, actually, Jake said, his grip tightening on the rifle. This is my property, and I don't appreciate implications that I'm harboring criminals. Nobody's implying anything, Coleman said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Just doing my job. A wounded Apache could be dangerous. Figured you'd want to know if one was nearby. If I see anything suspicious, I'll ride into town and let you know, Jake said firmly. But there's nothing here, just me and my horse. The tension stretched out like a wire pulled too tight. Jake could see Coleman calculating, weighing his options. The sheriff had no legal right to search out his cause, and forcing the issue would be difficult, with Jake armed and on his own property. Finally, Coleman nodded slowly. All right, Morrison, but you keep your eyes open. That Apache is out there somewhere, and she's dangerous. Jake couldn't stop the word from escaping. Coleman smiled grimly. Woman, probably mid-20s. She was wearing a dress with distinctive beadwork. Mrs. Patterson described it before she passed out. Some of the young bucks use women as scouts sometimes. Don't let that fool you into thinking she's harmless. I'll keep that in mind, Jake said. Coleman tipped his hat. You do that. And Morrison, if we find out you've been lying to us, well, folks in these parts have long memories about the Apache Wars. They don't take kindly to traitors. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Then Coleman wheeled his horse around, and the 4 riders galloped off, heading northwest. Jake stood on the porch until they were out of sight, his heart pounding. Then he went back inside. Aiyana was sitting up in bed, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She'd understood enough to know they'd been looking for her. They said, Apache attack, she asked, her English rough, but clear enough. Kill family? Jake nodded slowly. 3 days ago, southeast of here, a man was killed, woman and child wounded. Aiyana shook her head violently, then gasped and clutched her side. No, no, not my people, not me. I believe you, Jake said, moving to sit beside the bed. I believe you. Then who? Aiyana demanded. Who hurt them? Who hurt me? That was the question, wasn't it? Jake looked at her bruises, at the bullet wounds, at the evidence of violence that covered her body. Someone had beaten her, shot her, and left her to die. The same someone had attacked that family and made it look like an Apache raid. I don't know, Jake said, but I'm going to find out. Aiyana reached out and grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. They come back. They look again. They find me. Not if I can help it, Jake said. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Keeping her hidden was only a temporary solution. Eventually Coleman would return with more men and more authority. Eventually someone would discover the truth. And when that happened, all hell would break loose. Outside, the sun had reached its zenith, beating down on the Texas scrubland with merciless intensity. Inside the cabin, 2 people from different worlds sat in the dim light, bound together by blood and circumstance, knowing that their fragile peace couldn't last. But for now, for this moment, they had each other. And sometimes that had to be enough. The days that followed Sheriff Coleman's visit were tense. Jake found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, watching the horizon for dust clouds that might signal returning riders. He moved through his daily routines with military precision, but always with one eye on the cabin, one ear listening for trouble. Aiyana was healing, though slowly. The fever broke on the 6th day, and color began returning to her cheeks. She could sit up without gasping in pain, could take a few steps around the cabin without needing to lean on Jake's arm. Her body was mending, but Jake could see the wounds that went deeper than flesh, the haunted look that came into her eyes when she heard unexpected sounds, the way she flinched when he moved too quickly, the nightmares that woke her screaming in the dark hours before dawn. On the 8th day, Jake was outside chopping wood when he heard a crash from inside the cabin. He dropped the axe and ran, bursting through the door to find Aiyana on the floor beside the bed, a shattered water pitcher at her feet. "What happened?" Jake asked, kneeling beside her. "Are you hurt?" Aiyana's face was flushed with embarrassment and frustration. "Get water. Not want to bother you." "You're not a bother," Jake said, helping her back to the bed. "You're healing. You need to ask for help." "In my tribe," Aiyana said, her English improving daily. "Woman who cannot do for herself is burden, weak." Jake cleaned up the broken pottery, then brought her a cup of water from the bucket. "You're not weak. You were shot, beaten, left to die. The fact that you're alive at all is a damn miracle." Aiyana took the water but didn't drink. Instead, she looked at Jake with those dark, penetrating eyes. "Why you not ask?" "Ask what? What happened to me? Who hurt me? Why I was in ravine?" She set the cup aside. "You save me, clean wounds, feed me, but you not ask questions. Why?" Jake pulled his chair close and sat down. He'd been avoiding this conversation, telling himself she needed time to heal first. But the truth was, he'd been afraid of what she might tell him, afraid of what it might force him to do. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready," he said finally. "I am ready now," Aiyana said. She took a deep breath, wincing slightly as it pulled at her healing wounds. "I tell you everything. You deserve truth." Jake nodded, settling back in his chair. "All right, I'm listening." Aiyana's eyes grew distant, looking at something far beyond the cabin walls. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "My name is Aiyana of the Mescalero Apache. My father was Delgadito, a chief who sought peace with the white man. My mother died when I was child, sickness that came from the reservations. I have had a brother, Nenyehi. He was 2 years younger than me." She paused, swallowing hard. Jake waited, not pushing. 3 months ago, white men come to our small camp, not soldiers, not settlers, different men. They wear good clothes, ride expensive horses. They say they want to buy land, make offer to my father. Father, say land is not ours to sell. It belongs to the earth, to the sky, to the spirits. These men get angry. They say Apache have no right to any land, that we should be grateful for what reservation gives us. Jake felt a familiar anger building in his chest. He'd heard variations of this story too many times. My father tell them to leave. They go, but their leader, tall man with yellow hair and scar here. She touched her chin. He say we will regret this. He say one way or another, this land will be theirs. What happened then? Jake asked quietly. Nothing. For a while, we think maybe they forget about us. Our camp is small, only 15 people. My father, my brother, 3 other families. We live traditional way, hunt and gather. Stay away from white towns, we bother nobody. Aiyana's hands clenched into fists on the blanket. Then, 10 days ago, everything changed. At night, men come, not same men from before. These wear cloth over faces, move like shadows. They attack while we sleep. I hear screaming, gunfire. I grab knife, run outside. I see. Her voice broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she kept talking, forcing the words out. I see my father on ground, blood everywhere. I see Naliahau fighting 3 men so brave, so young. I try to help him, but someone hit me from behind. When I wake up, hands tied, thrown over horse. They take me and Naliahau away from camp. I hear fire behind us. They burn everything. Jake's jaw tightened. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated, deliberate. They ride for many hours, Aiyana continued. Finally stop at small camp. That is when I see him, the yellow-hair man from before. He is there, directing others. He see me and Nalia and smile, terrible smile. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. He say to us, your father was fool. This land belongs to the railroad now, or it will, once we clear out all the remaining Apache. But first, we need to make sure the army and settlers are good and motivated to finish the job. Understanding crashed over Jake like a cold wave. They were going to frame you for something. Aiyana nodded. They say they will attack settler families, make it look like Apache raid. Then army will come, clean out all remaining Apache camps in area, including ones that have nothing to do with attacks. Railroad gets land. Everyone blames Apache, and men like Yellow Hair get paid for their work. Jesus Christ, Jake breathed. They argue about what to do with us. Some say kill us now. Yellow Hair say no, keep us alive, make it look like we part of raid. If we die in fighting with settlers or soldiers, nobody can say different. If we captured alive, she shrugged. Apache woman and boy, caught near scene of massacre. Who would believe we are innocent? So what happened? Jake asked. How did you escape? Nalia Aiyana said, and fresh tears flowed. My brave, foolish brother, that night, when they are drinking, celebrating, he work his hands free from ropes. He free me too. He tell me, run, find help, tell the truth. I say I will not leave him. He say, one of us must survive to tell story. Must be you. You are stronger, faster. Please, sister. Her voice cracked completely, but she pushed on. I hear shouting. They discover we are free. Nalia push me toward horses. Go, he scream. Go. I run. I steal horse, ride hard. Behind me, I hear gunshots. So many gunshots. Jake reached out and took her hand. She gripped it like a lifeline. I ride all night. Horse gets spooked, throws me. I hurt leg. I try to walk, but men are tracking me. I run into ravine, think I can hide, but they find me, 3 of them. They beat me, try to make me tell where I go, who I plan to tell. I say nothing. One of them, young one with red hair, he say, she no good to us anyway, just kill her, and be done. Aiyana touched her side where the bullet wound was. He shoot me. I fall. They stand over me, making sure I am dead. I hold breath, stay very still. Finally, they leave. Say coyotes will finish the job. Nobody will ever find body. She looked at Jake, her eyes red, but clear. Then you find me. You save me. And now you know. I am not raider. I am not killer. I am victim, and only witness to what these evil men do. Jake sat back, his mind racing. This was worse than he'd thought. Much worse. If Aiyana was telling the truth, and every instinct told him she was, then there was a conspiracy here that went beyond simple violence. The railroad had been pushing west for years, and where the railroad went, corruption and blood usually followed. The family that was attacked, Jake said slowly, the one Sheriff Coleman mentioned. When did that happen? 3 days before you find me, Aiyana said. Same night I escaped. So they did exactly what they said they would. Attacked a family, made it look like Apache work, and now every settler in the territory will be crying for revenge. Jake stood and paced the small cabin. And you're the only one who knows the truth. My brother knew, Aiyana said quietly. But I think they kill him. I heard so many shots. The grief in her voice was so raw that Jake felt it in his own chest. He'd lost people too, friends, fellow soldiers, people he'd failed to save. He knew that particular pain. We don't know that for, Jake said, though he suspected she was right. But even if, he couldn't finish the sentence, even if the worst happened, we can still do something. We can tell people what really happened. Aiyana laughed bitterly. Who will believe a fish woman over white men, especially when those men have money, power? I believe you, Jake said firmly. And I'm white. I'm a former cavalry soldier. That has to count for something. You are one man. They are many, with many resources. Aiyana shook her head. And even if we try to tell truth, what happened when Yellow Hair and his men find out I am alive? They come here. They kill you for hiding me. They kill me to keep me quiet, and truth dies with us. She was right, and Jake knew it. But the alternative, doing nothing, letting these men get away with murder and conspiracy, was unacceptable. Then we need proof, Jake said. Something more than just your word against theirs. We need evidence, witnesses, something concrete. How? Aiyana asked. How we get proof? Jake thought hard. You said they had a camp where they took you and your brother. Is it far from here? Maybe one day ride, east and south, in the hills near the old Spanish mission. Jake knew the area, rough country full of caves and canyons. Good place to hide if you didn't want to be found. Could you find it again? Maybe, if I was stronger. She looked down at her bandaged wounds. But I cannot ride yet. Cannot even walk without pain. Then we wait, Jake said. You heal. Build your strength back. Meanwhile, I'll do some scouting, see what I can learn. When you're ready, we'll go together and find evidence. And then, he paused, realizing he was making promises he might not be able to keep. Then we'll figure out the next step. Aiyana studied him for a long moment. Why you do this? You risk everything. Your life, your safety. Why for me? For my people. Jake pulled his chair close again and sat down. Can I tell you a story? She nodded. 7 years ago, I was part of a cavalry unit stationed at Fort Concha. We got orders to clear out an Apache camp that had been raiding supply wagons. We rode out at dawn, 50 men, armed to the teeth. When we got there, Jake's voice grew thick. It wasn't a raiding party. It was families. Old people, women, children. Yeah, there were some warriors, but they were defending their families, not attacking anyone. He stared at his hands, seeing blood that no amount of washing could ever remove. My commanding officer ordered us to attack anyway. Said orders were orders. Most of the men followed without question. And I followed too. I told myself I was just a soldier, just doing my duty. What happened? Aiyana asked softly. We killed them. Almost all of them. The ones who survived scattered into the hills. Jake's voice dropped to a whisper. There was this girl. Couldn't have been more than 10 years old. She was trying to protect her little sister. I saw a soldier aim his rifle at them, and I pushed his arm, made him miss, gave those girls a chance to run. They did. He looked up at Aiyana. That night I couldn't sleep, kept seeing that little girl's face, the terror in her eyes, kept thinking about all the other children who didn't get a chance to run. And I realized something. Following orders doesn't absolve you of responsibility. Being a soldier doesn't make murder okay. So you left, Aiyana said. So I left, turned in my uniform, walked away from the army, came out here to the middle of nowhere. I thought maybe if I isolated myself, lived alone, didn't get involved in anything, I could somehow make up for what I'd done. But you can't make up for the past by hiding from the present. Jake met her eyes. When I found you in that ravine, dying, I had a choice. I could walk away like I'd walked away from everything else, or I could finally do something right. Save a life instead of taking one. So that's what I'm doing. Not because I think it erases what I've done. Nothing can do that. But because maybe, just maybe, it's a step toward being the man I should have been all along. Silence filled the cabin. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. In the distance, thunder rumbled, rare for October, but not unheard of. Finally, Aiyana spoke. In my language there is word, dasani. It means finding balance again after things have been broken. Making things right, not by erasing wrong, but by adding good to world. You understand? I think so, Jake said. This is what you do, dasani. She placed her hand over her heart, then reached out and touched Jake's chest. You are good man, Jake Morrison. Your past does not change this truth. Something in Jake's chest loosened, a knot he'd been carrying for 7 years, pulling a little less tight. He wasn't forgiven, not really. He could never be forgiven for what he'd done. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to live with himself. Thank you, he said quietly. A loud crack of thunder made them both jump. Rain began to fall, first a patter, then a downpour, drumming on the cabin's roof. Jake stood and checked the windows, making sure they were secure. When he turned back, Aiyana was struggling to lie down. Here, "Let me help," he said, adjusting the pillows behind her back. "Jake," she said as he pulled the blanket over her. "When I am stronger, when we find proof of what yellow hair men do, what then? What we do with evidence? Honestly, I don't know. Sheriff Coleman won't believe us. He's too set in his ways, and probably in someone's pocket, besides. The army might listen, but they might just see you as an enemy to be eliminated. And going to the newspapers could put targets on both our backs. So we have no good choices," Aiyana said. "Not yet, but we'll figure something out. One step at a time." The rain continued through the afternoon and into the evening. Jake made dinner rabbit stew from a snare he'd checked that morning, thickened with cornmeal and wild onions. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling. Aiyana ate 2 bowls, her appetite returning as her body healed. After dinner, as the storm raged outside, Jake sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, watching for any sign of trouble. Aiyana dozed fitfully, occasionally crying out in her sleep. Each time Jake would move to her bedside, speak soft words of comfort, until she settled again. Around midnight, the storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth. The moon emerged from behind the clouds, full and bright. Jake was about to doze off in his chair when Aiyana spoke from the bed. "Jake? Yeah? Thank you. For everything, for saving me, for believing me, for being here." Jake looked at her across the moonlit cabin. "You don't need to thank me." "Yes," she said firmly. In my darkest moment, when I think all white men are devils, you show me this is not true. You show me that good exists everywhere, even in unexpected places. You did the same for me," Jake admitted, "reminded me that Apache aren't the enemy. Hell, there is no enemy really, just people trying to survive, trying to protect what they love. The real enemies are men like Yellow Hair, men who use hate and fear to get what they want." "We will stop them," Aiyana said with quiet determination. "Together we will stop them." "Together," Jake agreed. He watched as her eyes drifted closed, her breathing evening out into genuine sleep. For the first time since he'd found her, she looked peaceful. Jake turned back to the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. Somewhere out there, evil men were planning more violence, more death. Somewhere out there, a young Apache boy might be dead or dying, his only crime being born into the wrong world at the wrong time. Somewhere out there, families lived in fear, not knowing that the real threat didn't come from Apache raiders, but from white men in expensive clothes. But here in this small cabin, 2 people from opposite sides of history's divide had found common ground, had found, against all odds and expectations, something that might have been friendship, or maybe something more. Jake wasn't naive enough to think this would be easy. He wasn't foolish enough to believe they could change the world. But maybe they could change one small part of it. Maybe they could bring justice to the people who deserved it, and truth to light that needed seeing. It was a start, and sometimes a start was all you needed. Outside, a coyote howled its lonely song to the moon. But inside the cabin, 2 souls found warmth in the shared darkness, and hope flickered like a candle flame, fragile, but burning nonetheless. 2 weeks passed. Aiyana grew stronger each day, her wounds healing with a resilience that impressed Jake. She could walk around the cabin without assistance now, though she still moved carefully, mindful of the stitches that pulled at her skin. The bruises had faded from purple to yellow-green, and the hollow look had left her cheeks. But it wasn't just her body that was healing. Something else was changing in the small cabin, something neither of them quite knew how to name. It started with small things. The way Jake found himself smiling when he heard Aiyana humming old Apache songs while she worked on mending her dress. The way Aiyana's eyes would light up when Jake returned from his daily rounds, as if his presence brought her comfort. The way they'd started sitting closer together in the evenings, not quite touching but near enough to feel each other's warmth. Jake tried to tell himself it was just gratitude, on her part, just responsibility on his. But he was lying to himself, and he knew it. One evening, as Jake was preparing dinner, Aiyana appeared at his elbow. She'd been practicing walking more each day, building her strength. "I help," she said, reaching for the knife he was using to cut wild turnips. "You should be resting," Jake protested, but she gave him a look that said she was done being an invalid. "I rest enough. Now I work." She took the knife from his hand, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through Jake, and from the way Aiyana's eyes widened slightly, she'd felt it too. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, falling into an easy rhythm. Aiyana's knife work was skilled, efficient, nothing wasted, everything purposeful. Jake found himself watching her hands, fascinated by their grace. "In my tribe," Aiyana said, breaking the silence, "women and men work together, hunt together, cook together, raise children together. Not like white world, where men do man things and women do woman things. Separate sounds more practical," Jake said, stirring the pot on the stove. "Is better way." Aiyana agreed. She added the turnips to the pot, then looked up at Jake. "You are not like other white men I know. You cook, clean, care for wounded. These are not things cavalry soldiers do, I think." Jake chuckled. "You'd be surprised. When you're in the field, miles from anywhere, you learn to do everything yourself or you don't survive. Besides, my mother raised me right before she passed. She always said a man who can't take care of himself is no man at all." "Your mother sounds wise," Aiyana said. "Tell me about her." They ate dinner at the small table Jake had built years ago. As they shared the simple meal, Jake found himself talking about things he hadn't spoken of in years. His childhood in Missouri, his mother's death from cholera when he was 15, his father's descent into drink and despair, how he'd joined the cavalry at 17, looking for purpose, for family, for something to believe in. "I thought the army would make me into something better," Jake said, pushing food around his plate. "Thought I was serving a noble cause, protecting innocent people, bringing civilization to the frontier. Took me years to realize I was just part of a machine that crushed anyone who got in the way of progress." Aiyana reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You were young, you did not know. And when you learned truth, you left. That takes courage. Or cowardice," Jake said bitterly. "I ran away instead of trying to change things from inside." "No," Aiyana said firmly. "You preserved yourself, kept your soul intact. That is not cowardice. That is survival." They sat in silence for a moment, hands still touching across the table. Then Aiyana spoke again, her voice softer. "I tell you about my mother?" "I'd like that," Jake said. "Her name was Kiana. It means brown hills. She was, how do you say, healer, medicine woman. She know every plant, every herb, what each one does. She teach me from when I was small child. Aiyana, she say, a woman who can heal is never powerless. When you can ease pain, stop bleeding, cure sickness, you have gift worth more than gold or horses." Aiyana smiled at the memory, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "She died when I was 13. White man's sickness, smallpox. It swept through reservation like fire. She tried to save everyone, work day and night, never rest. Finally, she gets sick too. I watch her fade away, and all her knowledge, all her medicine. It not enough to save her. I'm sorry," Jake said, squeezing her hand. "After she die, my father, he change, become harder. He say we must leave reservation. White man's world is poison. We go back to old ways, live free in hills. So we leave. Small group of us. For 12 years we live traditional way. Is hard, but is good. We are free. Until the railroad men came," Jake said. "Until yellow hair come," Aiyana agreed. "Until he destroy everything." Her voice hardened. "This is why we must stop him, not just for justice, for memory of my parents. my brother, my people, for all those who cannot speak anymore. Jake nodded. We will. I promise you that. Later that night, after they'd cleaned up from dinner, Jake sat by the fire, working on repairing a piece of tack. Aiyana settled onto the floor nearby, close to the warmth. She'd been teaching herself English with remarkable speed, and now she pulled out a worn Bible Jake kept on a shelf. One of the few books in the cabin. You read this? She asked, holding it up. Sometimes, not as much as I should, probably. My mother, she learned to read from missionaries. She teach me some, but English writing is... Aiyana frowned, searching for the word. Difficult. Apache is spoken, not written. Makes more sense. I could help you, Jake offered. If you want to learn more. Aiyana's face brightened. Yes. I want to learn. If I speak and read English better, people maybe take me seriously when we tell truth about yellow hair. So they began a new routine. Each evening after dinner, they would sit together by the fire, and Jake would help Aiyana with her reading and writing. She learned quickly, her sharp mind absorbing information like dry earth soaking up rain. And as they sat close together, their heads bent over pages, their shoulders touching, something grew between them that neither could deny. On the 18th day after Jake had found her, Aiyana announced she was ready to start training to regain her full strength. I need to be able to ride, shoot, run if necessary, she said. My body is weak still. Need to build back strength. Jake understood. In their world, weakness meant death. All right. We'll start slow. A little each day, but they'd left evidence behind. In a tent that had clearly been Greer's headquarters, Wheeler's men found documents, contracts with the railroad, maps marking Apache camps for removal, coded telegrams discussing clearing operations, and most damning of all, a ledger listing payments to various men for security services, with dates that matched the attacks on settler families. But it was what they found in another tent that made even the hardened soldiers fall silent. Personal items, dozens of them, beadwork, clothing, jewelry, weapons, all Apache in origin. Items that could only have come from the destroyed camps. Among them, Wheeler found a leather pouch with distinctive markings. Aiyana gasped when she saw it. That is my father's medicine pouch. He never go anywhere without it. Yellow hair must take it from his body. She collapsed to her knees, clutching the pouch, and wept for her father, for her brother, for her people, for everything she'd lost. Jake knelt beside her. Holding her, she grieved. Marshal Rourke stood over the collected evidence, his jaw tight. This is enough. More than enough. Captain Wheeler, I want every item catalogued and photographed. This is going to trial, and I want documentation that will stand up in any court in the country. Over the next week, everything changed rapidly. Silas Greer was formally arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and fraud. Under pressure, several of his men turned state's evidence, providing detailed testimony about the plot to frame Apache people for attacks Greer's men had committed. The railroad executives who'd hired Greer initially tried to distance themselves, claiming they'd known nothing about his methods, but the documents from his camp told a different story. Federal investigators descended on the railroad offices, and within days, arrest warrants were issued for 3 executives and 2 territorial politicians who'd been part of the conspiracy. The story spread like wildfire. Newspapers from Texas to New York ran headlines: Railroad Conspiracy Exposed, Apache Woman's Courage Reveals Truth, Former Cavalry Soldier Risks All for Justice. Not everyone believed it, of course. There were still those who insisted it was Apache lies, who claimed Jake was a traitor, who argued the railroad was just trying to bring progress to a savage land. But the evidence was overwhelming, and more importantly, people like Dutch Hendricks and his miners, ordinary folks with no stake in the matter except truth, testified to what they'd witnessed. The trial was held in San Antonio, with federal judges presiding. Jake and Aiyana both testified, as did dozens of others. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and when it was over, Silas Greer was sentenced to hang. His men received various prison sentences. The railroad executives were stripped of their positions and faced their own trial. But justice, Jake learned, was more complicated than he'd hoped. The surviving members of Aiyana's tribe, scattered after the attack, could not be found or compensated. The land they'd lived on was still claimed by the railroad, and the government showed little interest in returning it. Apache people across the territory still faced prejudice, suspicion, and violence. And Jake and Aiyana learned that being heroes in the newspapers didn't translate to acceptance in daily life. They'd stayed in San Antonio for the trial, renting a small room above a general store. But the looks they received, a white man and an Apache woman, living together, clearly in love, ranged from curious to hostile. Someone threw rocks through their window. Another time, they were refused service at a restaurant. One night, about a month after the trial ended, they sat together in their rented room, and Jake could see the exhaustion and sadness in Aiyana's eyes. "Maybe Dutch was right," Jake said quietly. "Maybe we should head to California, start completely fresh, where nobody knows our story." Aiyana was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Jake, I need tell you something I learned today." "What is it?" She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "I am with child. Your child." Jake's breath caught. Are you certain?" "I see doctor today. He confirmed, maybe 8 weeks." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "I know we not married in white man's way, or Apache way. I know world will judge us, judge this child. But Jake, I am not sorry. This child is made of love, real love, pure love. That should matter more than anything." Jake pulled her into his arms, his own tears flowing freely now. "It does matter. It's the only thing that matters." "God, Aiyana, I love you so much. You, and now this little one. We'll figure it out. Whatever it takes. We'll build a life where our child can grow up safe and love." "You still want this?" Aiyana asked. "Want me? Want us? Even though it will be hard?" "Especially because it will be hard," Jake said. "The easy path would be to walk away, pretend these feelings don't exist. Let the world tell us who we can and can't love. But I'm done with easy paths. I'm done living a life that means nothing. You and this child, you're my purpose now, my redemption, my home." They held each other as the San Antonio night deepened around them. Two people who'd found each other against impossible odds, who'd survived when they shouldn't have, who'd fallen in love when the world said they couldn't. The next morning, they made their decision. They would head west to California, as Jake had suggested. But first, there was something they needed to do. They traveled north, back to the area where Aiyana's camp had been. The ruins were still there, burned lodges, scattered belongings, land scarred by violence. But nearby, in a grove of cottonwood trees, they found what they were looking for: graves. The other miners from Dutch's camp had come here weeks ago, after the attack. They'd found the bodies of Aiyana's family and tribe, and given them proper burial, marking each grave with a simple wooden cross. Aiyana stood before 3 graves in particular. Her father, Aiyana stood before 3 graves in particular. Her father, Delgadito, and 2 smaller crosses that broke Jake's heart. One was marked Unknown Apache Child, but when Aiyana saw it, she gasped and fell to her knees. "Now they're hey," she whispered. "My brother. They found him." Jake knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders as she wept. According to the marker, Dutch's men had found the boy's body 3 miles from Greer's camp, where he'd been shot while trying to lead the men away from his sister. He'd died protecting her, just as he'd intended. For a long time, Aiyana simply cried, pressing her hands to the earth above her brother's grave. Then she began to sing, a low, mournful Apache death song that Jake didn't understand but felt in his bone. It was a sound of grief so pure and deep that even the birds seemed to fall silent to listen. When the song ended, Aiyana placed her father's medicine pouch, the one they'd recovered from Greer's camp on his grave. Then she took a knife and cut a lock of her own hair, dividing it between her father's and brother's graves. An Apache ritual of mourning. "I make you promise," she said in Apache, then switched to English so Jake could understand. "I promise I survive. I promise I tell truth. I promise your deaths mean something." She placed her hand on her stomach. "And I promise this child, your grandchild, your niece or nephew will know your names, will know your courage, will carry your memory forward." She stood, and Jake rose with her. Together they spent the afternoon at the graves. Aiyana telling Jake stories about her father's wisdom, her brother's mischievous humor, her mother's healing hand. She spoke of her people, not as the savages white society had painted them, but as human beings with hopes and dreams and love and loss. As the sun began to set, painting the cottonwood trees in gold, Aiyana took one last look at the graves. "I am ready now," she said, "ready to leave, to move forward. They will always be with me, in here." She touched her heart, "And in stories I tell our child, that is enough." They made camp that night under the stars, and as they lay wrapped in blankets, Jake told Aiyana about the future he imagined. "California," he said, "maybe near the ocean. We'll find a small piece of land, build a house with our own hands. I'll fish, hunt, maybe do some carpentry. You can grow a garden. Use your mother's healing knowledge to help people who need it. And our child will grow up free, free from the hate, free from the prejudice, free to be both Apache and white, or neither, or something entirely new." "You make it sound like dream," Aiyana said. "It is a dream, but sometimes dreams come true." Jake kissed her forehead. "We've survived impossible things, Aiyana. We've faced down death and conspiracy and hate and come through to the other side. If we can do that, we can do anything." They began their journey west the next morning. They traveled slowly, carefully, avoiding large towns where their presence might draw unwanted attention. They moved through small settlements, trading Jake's labor for supplies, sleeping under the stars more often than not. Along the way, they encountered both kindness and cruelty. In one small town, an elderly Mexican woman saw them and smiled knowingly, pressing a carefully wrapped package of food into Aiyana's hands with a whispered, "Vaya con Dios." In another place, a group of young men followed them to the edge of town, shouting slurs until Jake turned and faced them with such cold fury that they retreated. But slowly, mile by mile, they moved closer to their destination. And as they traveled, something beautiful happened. They began to teach each other. Aiyana taught Jake the Apache language, the names of plants and their healing properties, songs her mother had taught her, stories of the old days when her people had roamed free. She taught him to read the land the way Apache people did, to find water in the driest places, to move through terrain without leaving tracks. Jake taught Aiyana more English, how to read and write with increasing sophistication, mathematics and history, from books they acquired along the way. He taught her about the wider world beyond the Southwest, places she'd never seen but might one day visit. But more than knowledge, they taught each other about love. The kind of love that wasn't just passion or attraction, but deep partnership. They learned each other's wounds and how to be gentle with them. They learned each other's strengths and how to build on them. They learned that love wasn't just about feeling, it was about choosing, every single day, to stay and build and grow together. 3 months into their journey, as winter began to break and spring approached, they reached California. They'd crossed deserts and mountains, forded rivers, and survived storms. They'd spent their last money on supplies and had nothing left but each other and hope. They found themselves in a small coastal town called Crescent Bay, north of San Francisco. It was a rough settlement, fishermen, loggers, a few farmers, the kind of place where people were too busy surviving to care much about anyone else's business. Jake found work immediately with a local boat builder who needed skilled hands and didn't ask questions. The pay was modest, but honest. They rented a tiny shack on the edge of town. and Aiyana began fixing it up, making it into something that resembled a home. The pregnancy was showing now impossible to hide. Some people stared, but most simply went about their business. The owner of the general store, a widow named Mrs. Chen, who'd emigrated from China decades ago, took a particular interest in Aiyana. "You know what it's like," she said, one day as Aiyana shopped for fabric. "To be different, to have people look at you like you don't belong. But you build life anyway. You don't let them define you." "Yes," Aiyana said quietly, "that is exactly right." Mrs. Chen smiled. "Your baby is lucky. We'll have strong mother, brave father. We'll learn to be strong too." As spring deepened into summer, Jake and Aiyana's life began to take shape. Jake's skills impressed his employer enough that he was offered a partnership in the boat-building business. They saved every penny, aimed to buy land and build their own house. But more importantly, they built a community. Mrs. Chen became a friend, teaching Aiyana about Chinese herbal medicine that complemented her Apache knowledge. The boat builder's wife, a kind woman named Sarah, helped Aiyana prepare for the baby's arrival. Even the gruff fishermen who worked the docks began to nod in greeting when Jake passed. It wasn't perfect. There were still suspicious looks, still occasional cruel words. Once a drunk logger tried to cause trouble at the general store, shouting about half-breed bastards, until Jake quietly stepped between him and Aiyana. The man took one look at Jake's eyes that had seen war and death, and had nothing left to fear, and stumbled away. But these were isolated incidents in a life that was, against all odds, becoming something resembling normal, something resembling happy. On a warm evening in late July, as Jake and Aiyana sat on their small porch watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, Aiyana suddenly grabbed Jake's hand and placed it on her swollen belly. "Feel that?" she asked. Jake felt it, a strong kick, their child making its presence known. His eyes filled with tears. "Our baby's a fighter, like parents," Aiyana said with a smile. Then her expression grew more serious. "Jake, I want to marry you, not in church, they would not let us anyway, but in our own way, Apache way and white way mixed together, something that is ours." "I'd like that," Jake said. "More than anything." They planned it for the next full moon. Mrs. Chen and Sarah helped them prepare. On the appointed night, on the beach with the ocean as witness, they stood together as the moon rose silver and huge over the water. Sarah had helped Aiyana make a simple white dress, and Mrs. Chen had woven flowers into her hair. Jake wore his only good shirt and had shaved his beard, looking younger than he had in years. There was no preacher. They wouldn't have been able to find one willing anyway. Instead, Jake and Aiyana spoke their own vows, mixing English and Apache, Christian and tribal traditions, creating something entirely their own. "I, Jake Morrison," Jake said, his voice strong and clear, "take you, Aiyana, as my wife. I promise to protect you, honor you, cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to be father to our child and any children who follow. I promise to build a life with you that our children can be proud of. In this life, and whatever comes after, you are my heart." Aiyana's turn. "I, Aiyana, of the Mescalero, Apache," she said, tears streaming down her face, "take you, Jake Morrison, as my husband. I promise to stand beside you in all things. I promise to share your burdens and your joys. I promise to raise our children to be strong and kind, to know both their heritages and to be proud of both. You saved my life, and now I give it to you freely. You are my home." They exchanged simple rings, silver bands Jake had made himself in the boat builder's workshop. Then, as their small gathering of friends cheered, they kissed while the waves crashed behind them and the moon blessed them with silver light. It was, Jake thought, the happiest moment of his life. 2 months later, on a cool September morning, their child came into the world. The birth was long and difficult. Sarah and Mrs. Chen attended, while Jake paced outside, listening to Aiyana's cries and feeling more helpless than he'd ever felt facing armed men. But when he finally heard a new sound, a baby's strong, furious wail, he nearly collapsed with relief. Sarah opened the door, smiling. "Come meet your son." Jake entered to find Aiyana exhausted, but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cloth. She looked up at him with such love and joy that his heart felt too large for his chest. "Our son," she said softly. "Come hold him." Jake sat carefully on the bed and took the baby in his arms. The child was perfect, tiny fingers, a shock of dark hair, golden brown skin that was the exact blend of his parents. As Jake watched, the baby's eyes opened, dark like his mother's, but with flecks that might one day be blue like his father's. "What should we name him?" Jake asked. Aiyana had been thinking about this for months. In Apache tradition, names have meaning, tell story. "I think we should call him Neliehe, after my brother, but also give him your father's name for White World." "What was it?" "Thomas," Jake said. "Thomas Morrison. Thomas Neliehe Morrison," Aiyana said, testing the name. "Is good name, strong name, name that honors past, but looks to future." "It's perfect," Jake agreed. "He's perfect." They sat together like that, Jake and Aiyana, and their newborn son, while outside the California sun climbed higher in the sky, and the Pacific Ocean sang its eternal song. And somewhere in the world, people still fought and hated and killed over differences that seemed so small in moments like this. But in this room, in this moment, there was only love. The years that followed weren't always easy, but they were good. Jake and Aiyana built their house, a simple but sturdy structure on 2 acres of land they purchased with their savings. They planted a garden, kept chickens, and Jake built a workshop where he crafted furniture and boats. Aiyana became known in Crescent Bay as a healer, using her mother's knowledge to help people with ailments. The town's single doctor couldn't always cure. At first people were skeptical, but after she saved a fisherman's son from a fever that would have killed him, word spread. Soon people from up and down the coast were seeking her help. Thomas, or Tommy as his parents called him, grew into a bright, curious child. By age 5, he could speak both English and Apache fluently. He learned to fish with his father and identify healing plants with his mother. He learned Apache songs and American history, traditional stories, and Christian prayers. He was in every way a bridge between 2 worlds, but he also learned about hate. One day, when Tommy was 6, he came home from town with a bloody nose and torn shirt. Jake found him crying in the barn, and it took patient coaxing to learn what happened. "Billy Henderson said I was a half-breed," Tommy sobbed. "Said I didn't belong anywhere. Said my mama was a savage, and my daddy was a traitor. So I hit him, and he hit me back." "And stop," Jake said gently, pulling his son into his arms. "You did nothing wrong. Billy Henderson is scared and ignorant, and that makes him cruel. But you can't let his words define who you are." "But Papa, is it true? Am I not supposed to exist?" Jake's heart broke. He'd known this day would come, but that didn't make it any easier. "Listen to me, son. You are exactly who you're supposed to be. You exist because your mother and I loved each other more than we feared the world. You carry the best of both of us, and that makes you special. Not wrong. But people will always hate me for it," Tommy said. "Some people will," Jake admitted, "but many won't. And the people who matter, the people who see you for who you really are, they'll love you. Like Miss Shun, like Sarah, like all the folks in this town who know your worth." That night, after Tommy was asleep, Jake and Aiyana lay in bed talking. "Maybe we should tell him," Jake said, "about how we met, about everything that happened. He is still so young," Aiyana worried, "but he needs to know, needs to understand that the love between us, the love that made him, wasn't easy or simple, that it cost us everything and was worth every price, that he comes from courage, not shame." So on Tommy's 7th birthday, they told him the whole story. They told him about the ravine, about the conspiracy, about the fight for truth and justice. They told him about his Apache grandfather and uncle who had died heroes. They told him about the choice Jake had made to save Aiyana instead of walking away. Tommy listened with wide eyes, asking questions, trying to understand. When they finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "So you're saying I'm alive because Papa chose love over hate?" "Yes," Aiyana said. "That is exactly what we are saying. And Grandfather Delgadito and Uncle Nalia Hay died so Mama could live to tell the truth." "Yes," Jake confirmed. Tommy stood up straighter. "Then I'll make sure they didn't die for nothing. I'll make sure everyone knows that Apache people aren't savages, that we're all just people, and I'll make sure no one else has to go through what you did." Jake and Aiyana exchanged a look of pride and concern. Their son was growing up too fast, learning too young that the world could be cruel, but he was also learning something more important, that love could overcome that cruelty, that courage mattered, that one person's choice to do right could change everything. As Tommy grew older, he became a voice for understanding in Crescent Bay. He made friends across all racial lines, Chinese, Mexican, white, native. He stood up for those who were bullied or marginalized. At 15, he gave a speech at the schoolhouse about his heritage, speaking eloquently about both his Apache and white roots, bringing many in the audience to tears. Jake and Aiyana watched their son grow with amazement and pride. He was becoming everything they'd hoped: strong, kind, brave, compassionate, living proof that love could indeed conquer hate. Jake was 53 when the letter came. It was from Washington, from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. With trembling hands he opened it while Aiyana looked on anxiously. He read it once, then twice, unable to believe what he was seeing. "What is it?" Aiyana asked. "It's..." Jake's voice broke. "It's an official apology from the government for the conspiracy, for the attacks on Apache people, for everything that happened. They're offering reparations to survivors, and they're..." He looked up at her, tears in his eyes. "They're offering to return the land. Your family's land. The place where your father and brother are buried." Aiyana covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face. "After all these years..." "After all these years," Jake confirmed. "There's more. They want you to testify before Congress, want you to tell your story so it becomes part of the official record, so it can never be forgotten or denied." 2 months later, Jake, Aiyana and 18-year-old Tommy traveled to Washington, D.C. It was Aiyana's first time in the nation's capital, and she was overwhelmed by the size, the noise, the crowd. But when she stood before the Congressional Committee and began to speak, telling her story in clear, perfect English, describing the loss of her family, the conspiracy, the choice Jake had made, the fight for truth, the room fell silent. Congressmen who'd been talking or shuffling papers stopped and listened. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the chamber. The next day, newspapers across the country ran her testimony. The headline in the Washington Post read, "Apache Woman's Story Reminds Nation of Cost of Prejudice." The New York Times ran an editorial calling for renewed efforts at reconciliation with Native peoples. It wasn't enough to undo the harm, of course. Nothing could do that. But it was acknowledgement. It was truth, entering the historical record. It was a step toward healing. Before they left Washington, they met with other Apache representatives, people who'd survived the wars and the reservation system, who were fighting for their people's rights and recognition. Aiyana shared her mother's healing knowledge with younger generation, taught them songs she remembered, kept the tradition alive. "You are bridge," an elderly Apache medicine woman told Aiyana, "between old ways and new world, between our people and theirs. This is sacred work, hard work, but important." Jake was 61 when his health began to fail. Years of hard living, old war wounds, and a lifetime of carrying heavy burdens finally caught up with him. The doctor in Crescent Bay diagnosed a weak heart and told him gently that he likely didn't have long. Jake took the news calmly. He'd lived longer than he'd expected, been happier than he'd ever imagined possible. but his heart broke at the thought of leaving Aiyana and Tommy. On a warm spring afternoon, sitting on the porch of the house he'd built with his own hands, overlooking the garden Aiyana had tended for 26 years, Jake called his family together. Tommy was 26 now, married to a kind woman named Rebecca, who loved him despite, or perhaps because of his mixed heritage. They'd given Jake and Aiyana 2 grandchildren, both beautiful blends of multiple heritages. "I need to say some things," Jake told them, "while I still can." "Papa, don't," Tommy started. "Listen," Jake said gently. "I'm not afraid of dying. I've had a good life. Better than I deserved, better than I'd ever hoped for. But I need you to know some things." He turned to Tommy. "Son, you are my greatest pride. You took the difficult circumstances of your birth and turned them into strength. You've shown people that love is more powerful than hate, that courage matters, that one person can make a difference. Keep doing that. Teach your children to do it. Never let the world make you ashamed of who you are." Tommy nodded, tears streaming down his face. Then Jake turned to Aiyana, taking her hands in his. Even at 51, she was beautiful. Her hair streaked with silver now, lines around her eyes and mouth, but still the same woman he'd carried out of that ravine 26 years ago. "Aiyana," he said, his voice breaking, "you saved me. I know everyone says I saved you, but it was the other way around. I was dead inside when I found you, a walking ghost, hollowed out by guilt and shame. But you gave me purpose. You gave me hope. You gave me a reason to be better than I was. You gave me love when I thought I was beyond deserving it." "Jake," Aiyana whispered, gripping his hands tightly. "I need you to do something for me," Jake continued. "When I'm gone, I want you to take my ashes back to that ravine where we met. I want to rest there in the place where my real life began. Can you do that?" "Yes," Aiyana said through her tears. "But Jake, you promise me something too. You promise you wait for me, on other side, in whatever come next, you wait for me. Because I cannot imagine eternity without you." "I promise," Jake said. "I'll wait as long as it takes." 2 weeks later, on a quiet morning with the ocean breeze blowing through the open window, and Aiyana holding his hand, Jake Morrison took his last breath. His final words were, "I see you, Aiyana. I'll always see you." The funeral was held on the beach, where they'd been married. Hundreds came, fishermen and boat builders, Chinese immigrants and Mexican farmers, native people who'd traveled from across California to honor the man who'd stood with them. Even some former cavalry soldiers who'd served with Jake showed up, old men now, paying respects to a comrade who'd had the courage to choose conscience over orders. Tommy gave the eulogy, speaking of his father's courage, his love, his choice to be better than his worst moment. He spoke of how Jake had proved that redemption was possible, that people could change, that love could overcome the darkest history. "My father once told me," Tommy said, "that he'd stopped dreaming until he met my mother, that she'd given him back the ability to hope. I think that's the greatest gift anyone can give another person, the belief that tomorrow can be better than today, that love can win, that one person's choice matters." After the funeral, true to her promise, Aiyana took Jake's ashes back to Texas. Tommy and Rebecca accompanied her, along with the grandchildren. They traveled to the ravine where it all began, a place that looked the same but felt different, sanctified by time and memory. Aiyana stood at the edge of the ravine, holding the wooden box that contained Jake's ashes. She spoke in Apache, then in English, telling the story one more time for her grandchildren, for the land itself, for history. "Here is where our love began," she said. "Here is where Jake Morrison chose compassion over indifference, love over. Here is where he saved my life, and in doing so, saved his own soul. Here is where 2 worlds met and became one." She scattered the ashes, watching them catch the wind and swirl through the ravine, settling on the red earth and the rocks and the thin stream that still ran along the bottom. Then she spoke directly to Jake, as if he could hear her, and perhaps he could. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for our son, our grandchildren, our life together. I will love you until my last breath, and then I will find you again. This I promise." Aiyana lived another 12 years. She spent them teaching, healing, telling stories. She became a respected elder, sought out by young people from all backgrounds who wanted to understand how to build bridges between divided communities. She never remarried. "I had my great love," she would say. "One lifetime with Jake was worth 100 lifetimes with anyone else." On a warm September evening, the same month and almost the same day as Tommy's birth 40 years earlier, Aiyana died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her family. Her last word was Jake. They buried her in Crescent Bay, in the cemetery overlooking the ocean, next to an empty grave marked with Jake's name. Tommy placed 2 stones side by side, one for his mother, one for his father, and between them he planted a small cottonwood tree, transplanted from Texas, from the grove where Aiyana's family was buried. On both stones, he had the same inscription carved: "Love is stronger than hate. Truth is more powerful than lies. One person's courage can change the world." Years later, Tommy's children asked him about their grandparents. By then, Tommy was an old man himself, a respected judge who'd spent his life fighting for equality and justice. He'd written books about his parents' story, given lectures across the country, ensured that their tale would never be forgotten. He took his grandchildren to the cemetery and told them the story, all of it, about the ravine, about the conspiracy, about the choice that had changed everything, about how love had conquered hate, how courage had defeated fear, how 2 people from opposite sides of a brutal history had found each other and built something beautiful. "Your great-grandfather once told me," Tommy said, "that some dreams are worth dying for, but the best dreams are worth living for." He and your great-grandmother lived for their dream, a world where love mattered more than prejudice, where people were judged by their hearts rather than their heritage. That dream isn't fully realized yet, but it's closer than it was, and every generation that fights for it, that refuses to give up, brings it closer still. One of his grandchildren, a bright-eyed girl named Aiyana, after her great-grandmother asked, "Do you think they're together now, Papa Tommy? Your mama and Papa?" Tommy smiled, looking at the 2 stones and the cottonwood tree growing between them, its leaves rustling in the ocean breeze. "Yes," he said with certainty, "yes, I do. I think somewhere beyond all this, where love is all that matters, they found each other again, and they're waiting for the rest of us, whenever our times come." The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors as that long-ago Texas sunset when Jake had first carried Aiyana to safety. The same colors of hope, of love, of second chances. And in that moment, it seemed to Tommy that he could almost see them, his father and mother, young again, whole again, standing together with their hands joined, looking back at the life they'd built and the legacy they'd left, and smiling. Because in the end, love had won. Not easily, not completely, but truly. And that was enough. That was more than enough. It was everything.